On Monday, 25th of May, 2020, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds until George Floyd passed away. According to the prosecution's opening statement, 4 minutes and 45 seconds has Floyd cried out for help. 53 seconds has Floyd failed due to seizures. 3 minutes and 51 seconds as Floyd was unresponsive. Now, at the time in May 2020, most of the Western world was experiencing at the beginning of a global pandemic. We were at the beginning of a new style of living. We were in lockdown. This situation led to the death of George Floyd. So why did it make a difference? Why was the death of one black man in America causing so much civil unrest within the environment of the Western world? And I noticed that what we ended up having is a situation where people were looking towards the George Floyd murder and recognizing that maybe the civil unrest has been caused due to an age-old issue. You see, the concept of black versus white is not new. The concept of police brutality is not new. So why the murder of George Floyd made such a difference and an impact and caused civil unrest? Now, some people claim that this was due to the fact that many people, many white privileged people, were in a lockdown status and they had nothing better to do other than being at home and stuck to the televisions. There are other voices that claim that this was due to the fact that the virus was mimicking a very human trait, a trait of targeting people of color. Whatever the reasons for this phenomena, I started thinking, what is it that I can do? And this led to me going through a process. I started becoming curious. I started thinking about my own privileges, about the privileges of being able to speak, the privilege of walking, the privilege of breathing, the privilege of living on this earth. You see, these are all unearned privileges that have been bestowed upon me. I've not earned them. So why would this make a big difference? See, I had a privilege of attending Harvard Business School, and I recall, as I landed in Boston and went into Cambridge, crossed over a bridge, and there was in graffiti writing that said Black Lives Matter. I saw this, but I didn't really acknowledge it because I was too excited. I'm going to Harvard. Look, Mum, I'm at Harvard. And when I went into Harvard, what I saw was a number of domestic and menial duties were being carried out by Black and Latino staff. And when I was studying under Professor Bill George, Leadership and Management, True North, finding and aligning your own values, and we learned about white leaders. And I spoke to, post George Floyd's death, I spoke to Professor Bill George, and I expressed my observations of what I had seen. And I'm pleased to say 2 months ago, Bill published a book about diversity and inclusion and the impact it has on organizations and how beneficial it is. And a number of diverse leaders are mentioned and illustrated in that book. You see, the point here is institutions, privileged institutions, such as Harvard, are steeped in a historical, prejudiced, biased, racist history. So, what do we do about this? It's very complex, you see, having these conversations. What I did is I started having conversations here locally at Doncaster. And I started talking to people in power, talking to local political leaders. I had conversations with the place that I work at with my CEO, Damien Allen, who's here today. And I got the mandate and secured the mandate for the Ethnic Culture Fusion Network to be formed. And our objective was really clear. We wanted meaningful change. We wanted cultural competence for Doncaster. So we knew that there's reams and reams of data, reams and reams of information out there. There's narratives and counter-narratives, arguments and counter-arguments. All this information around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And the wheel of complexity consistently pits one protected characteristics against the other. We'll see housing has an impact and an overlap, an intersectionality with education, say, or education has with poverty, poverty has with gender. The gender inequality battle has been raging for over 150 years. Yet, if we look within boardrooms today, do we see gender inequality? We can go to a mechanic's garage and do we see gender inequality there? So, what we are aware of, that it's immensely complex, but the intersectionality, the overlapping of these inequalities that are constantly pitted against each other, vying for pole position by design, race inequality is consistently the poorest relative of all the inequalities. And no wonder it's difficult to then start fixing the problem. So what we wanted to do was have these open, honest conversations and an ability to be able to fix an age-old problem. This led to a three-layered cake, a three-layered magic cake. The Race Equity Continuum Paradigm allows us to start looking at and having these difficult conversations. So the key ingredient here, there's three zones that we have: the comfort zone, the uncomfortable zone, and the collaborative community zone. You see, me standing here today is incredibly uncomfortable. As an individual, as a human being, I am one, I have to take onus of myself, my own environment. But there's a second part to it. There's at an organizational level, at a cultural, the third level is the cultural level and the societal level. So those three parts make human, the organization, and the cultural level. Moving from these zones, from the comfortable to the uncomfortable, that's where our true learning occurs, in that uncomfortable zone. And finally moving to the third zone of collaborative community. So that's the first layer of the three-layered magic cake. We've moved to the second layer. And this is a huge component which we start off with, forgiveness. There has to be a margin of forgiveness. If you look at all the greats, they've suffered humiliation, embarrassment. People like Rosa Parks, Muhammad Ali, Mahatma Gandhi, they had huge levels of humiliation. But there was a margin of forgiveness. We cannot change what happened 400 years ago. We cannot change the colonial history. But what we can do is look for meaningful change now. And there has to be a level of forgiveness within that space. Memna Resnick talks about the good pain and bad pain. He's a therapist in America who's written a book, My Grandmother's Hands, and the racialized trauma that people carry with them. The margin of forgiveness has to come from the good pain, not the bad pain that we hold on to. Otherwise, we will not see meaningful change. Leadership is immensely important. You see, there's a level of leadership within all of us. There's a sphere of control that we have. And that leadership is not just about looking towards our delegated leaders. It's about actually providing a solution and looking at other leaders and yourselves and then shifting in that space. Much like a child would hold account to a parent who's doing wrong. We need to hold our leaders to account if there's any wrong within that. And allyship, growth, and positive change. So I use the acronym FLY the flag for positive change in this second 3-tier layer. We move to the third layer. Now, anybody that knows me, I love my koi fish. And I tend to my koi fish and I start thinking whilst I'm feeding them and doing it. And I think, oh, do you know what? Without me, these koi fish, they couldn't do anything. But the reality is the fish will be in their pond and they will do what the fish do. And then I start looking at it, at the comparison. Isn't this akin to many of our organizations, many of our environments that we have? How do we know if they're toxic? How do we know if we're happy with the status quo? Are we happy with that status quo? These are the basic levels that we are mandated to do, especially within organizations. And so that first level of status quo leads us to the second level, which is what we end up doing is tinkering. We tinker with a few policies, we tinker with a few courses, and guess what? We've achieved some tick boxes. Brilliant. We're in our comfortable zone. Remember the zones I was talking about, the 3 zones? We're still remaining within that comfort zone. And then this is where the uncomfortable starts. Let's empower people. Let's have safe spaces. Here at Doncaster Council, what we started over a year ago with the formation of Ethnic Culture Fusion Network and securing that mandate, we started safe spaces, open and honest conversations. And that took courage, that took a sense of vulnerability. And that wasn't just from one side, it was both parts, people who were sharing in those conversations. Those safe spaces and those ideas led to having a vision. And the vision was clear. Let's innovate. Let's do things differently. The equality and diversity and inclusion and the reams and rafts of data that we have out there aren't working. Let's dream big. Most importantly, let's think human. We're all human beings. If you look at research anywhere in the world, most human beings have the same aspirations. Health, wealth, looking after your children, education. What are we going to do in our old age? So think human. And then the last box is inclusion. Diversity really thrives when we've allowed people to have a sense of belonging. When equality and equity is recognized, but it needs to be sustainable. And sustainability is not by just saying this is the last box that we've looked at. It's about a cyclical process of us going back round into that state, of going back to that comfort state that we've achieved, into that uncomfortable, moving into a collaborative community. And the collaborative community, today we are all a collaborative community. We are participating in an understanding of moving us from that comfortable state that I hope you were in, moving into an uncomfortable state, into that collaborative community. So when we put the magic 3-layered cake, maybe I should rename this to a 3-layered magic cake instead of the Race Equity Continuum Paradigm. But because when we fly the flag for positive change, when we bring together those 3 zones, and when we have Stevie, I'll use the acronym Stevie. I wish it was Abdul or a guru, but unfortunately Stevie, so we'll stick with Stevie. And the status quo, the tinkering. And what we've ended up getting is a 3-layered magic cake. Now, this is where the magic occurs. You can use this paradigm for change, for meaningful change within your environments. Whether you are working for an organization or you're not, whether you wear a uniform or you don't, whether you're male or female, whether you recognize yourself as not. If you're a human being, you will be able to use the race equity continuum paradigm for meaningful change within your environments, as long as you recognize that you and others are human beings. Thank you.